Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The silent arrival. I remember the exact moment I realized I could scream at the top of my lungs in my own living room. And no one would hear me, not because my husband was deaf, but because we had stopped speaking the same language long before we ever boarded that plane to America. You see, loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being invisible. And standing in our pristine, perfectly decorated suburban home in Ohio, with the snow piling up outside and a man who shared my last name sleeping in the next room, I had never felt more invisible in my entire life. This isn't the story of a woman who lost her husband. It's the story of a woman who lost herself somewhere between the immigration forms and the American dream, only to realize that the marriage she was fighting to save was already drowning in a silence she couldn't translate. Most people assume that moving to a new country with your partner is an adventure, a shared battle against the unknown. But what happens when the battle isn't against the country, but against the person sitting right next to you at the dinner table? I remember trying to make small talk with my husband, Mark, about the absurdity of American portion sizes, how the coffee was too weak, how the neighbors smiled too wide but never actually asked how you were doing. He would just shrug and say, "That's just how it is here," before burying his face in his phone. I wasn't just learning English during those first few months. I was learning a whole new language of indifference. I'd watch the evening news, repeating the anchor's words like a parrot, hoping to sound less foreign. But every word that came out of my mouth felt like I was wearing someone else's clothes, uncomfortable, ill-fitting, and slightly ridiculous. My brain would translate everything twice, once from my native tongue to English, and once from what I actually felt to what was acceptable to say. And somewhere in that double translation, I lost the ability to say, "I am hurting." I said, "I am fine," instead, and the terrifying part was that I almost believed it. But here's the twist that no one prepared me for. While I was busy trying to decode American culture and salvage my marriage, my husband had already started building a life that didn't include me. I found it not in his phone, not in a text message, but in the way he started using American idioms I had never heard him say before. Phrases that didn't exist in our old life. And then, one Friday night, I opened the wrong drawer in his office looking for a pen, and I found a receipt that made my blood run colder than the Ohio winter outside. It wasn't an affair. It was something far more devastating to our future, and it forced me to confront a question I had been running from since the day we landed. Why do we hold on to people who have already let go of us? Where is my husband? That receipt wasn't for a hotel, a gift, or anything you might expect from a husband sneaking around. It was a consultation fee for a divorce attorney, dated 3 months before we even landed on American soil. And I realized with a sickening clarity that my husband had been planning our end long before I ever started fighting for our beginning. The most heartbreaking part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the quiet relief I felt washing over me, the shameful whisper in my head that finally I understood why he had grown so distant. You see, sometimes the worst part of a failing marriage isn't the fighting, it's the absence of fighting. The peaceful silence that feels more like a funeral than a home. And I had been living in that silence for years without knowing the cause. Mark had been checked out emotionally for so long that I had convinced myself it was just cultural differences, just the stress of immigration. Just the challenge of learning a new language and a new life. I would practice English phrases in front of the mirror, repeating "How was your day?" And "I missed you" until my tongue memorized the shapes, thinking that if I could just sound more American, if I could just speak his language perfectly, he would see me again, the woman he married. But the language wasn't the problem. The problem was that he had already stopped listening. I remember standing in the kitchen that night, holding that receipt with trembling hands, and trying to remember the last time Mark had looked at me the way he used to, before we left our home country. Before the paperwork and the plane tickets and the promises that this move would fix everything. And my brain did a cruel thing. It showed me a memory from 7 years ago, back when we were both young and foolish and deeply in love. When he would laugh at my broken English and say it was cute, when he would hold my face and say my accent was his favorite sound. Now he doesn't flinch when I cry. He doesn't notice when I stop talking. And the worst part is, he's not even being cruel, he's just being absent. The way a person absent from a relationship becomes a ghost that still eats dinner with you. But here's where the story twists again, because I decided that night that I would not let that receipt define me. That I would not let his quiet exit become my quiet ending. I decided to learn English not for him, but for myself, not to sound American, but to find my own voice in a country where I had been voiceless. I took that receipt, folded it into a tiny square, and put it in my pocket as a reminder that the loneliest place in America isn't a desolate highway or an empty apartment, it's a marriage where you're the only one still trying. And as I stood in the darkness of my suburban kitchen, I heard the front door open, and Mark walked in with groceries and that same polite smile. The kind you give a colleague, and I opened my mouth to say something, anything, and I realized I had completely forgotten how to speak in any language. Lost in translation. You know that moment when you're trying to explain something deeply important, something that's been eating away at your soul for months, and the words come out sounding like a broken GPS giving directions to a place that doesn't exist anymore. That was my entire life for the first 6 months in America, and I hated it more than the snow, more than the weak coffee, more than the neighbors who waved but never really saw me. The most exhausting part of living in a country where you're not fluent isn't the grocery stores or the paperwork or even the awkward silences at the bank, it's the constant, grinding awareness that you're never quite saying what you actually mean. That your feelings are being filtered through a language you're still borrowing, and somewhere in that translation, the most important parts of you are getting lost. I remember trying to tell Mark that I felt like I was drowning, that the loneliness was so physical I could taste it like metal on my tongue. But what came out was I am not feeling good today, because I didn't know the word for suffocating or abandoned or please. Please just hold me and tell me everything will be okay. And he would nod, say sorry you're sick, and walk away. And I would stand there hating myself for not knowing how to say the one thing that could have saved us. It wasn't just the big conversations that failed me, it was the small ones too. The daily rituals of marriage that had once felt so natural in our native language but now felt like I was performing a play where I had forgotten all my lines. I'd try to joke about the absurdity of American supermarkets, the aisles of cereal, the wall of cheese. The sheer overwhelming choice of everything, and Mark would just stare at me blankly, not because the joke wasn't funny, but because my timing was off. My rhythm was wrong, and the cultural references didn't land the way they used to. And I watched as he started to find that humor elsewhere, with colleagues who spoke his language, literally and figuratively. People who didn't have to pause to find the right word. Who didn't accidentally say I'm pregnant when they meant I'm embarrassed during a work dinner. Yes, that actually happened. And I still can't look at his boss's wife without turning crimson. The thing about living in a country where English isn't your first language is that you become a permanent observer. Always on the outside of the joke, always the last one to understand, always the one nodding along while secretly screaming inside. And I was so busy trying to master the language of my new country that I completely forgot that marriage has its own language, one that has nothing to do with grammar and everything to do with presence, with being seen, with someone knowing the shape of your pain without you having to spell it out. But here's what I learned the night I finally broke down at a Walmart, of all places. Crying in the middle of the cleaning supplies aisle because I couldn't remember the word for broom. Your worth is not measured by your vocabulary. And the people who truly love you will wait for you to find your words, even if it takes forever. That night, I went home and wrote a letter to Mark, a letter I never gave him, in English so broken it looked like a toddler wrote it. And in that letter I poured every emotion I couldn't say aloud, and when I read it back to myself, I realized something devastating. I could finally express myself in English, but I had no idea anymore how to say any of it to my husband. The cold that wasn't weather. I used to think that the coldest thing about Ohio was the winter wind that sliced through my coat like a knife through butter. But I was wrong. The real cold was the silence that filled our house every evening, the kind of quiet that has weight. That sits on your chest until you forget what it feels like to breathe easily. And I learned that American winters are nothing compared to the freeze of a marriage that has already died but forgotten to bury itself. The snow piled up outside our windows like a second layer of isolation, and I would watch it fall for hours. Practicing English words in my head like a prayer, snowflake, blizzard, freeze, thaw, hoping that if I learned enough weather words, I could somehow control the climate inside my own home. But you can't warm up a house with vocabulary, and you can't melt a frozen heart with perfect pronunciation. And I was learning that the hard way as I navigated my first American winter completely alone. Even with a husband sleeping 6 feet away from me every night. There's something about extreme cold that makes loneliness feel more permanent. Like the frost has settled into your bones and no amount of hot tea or heated blankets can chase it away. And I remember standing in our kitchen one morning, watching the thermometer outside read -15 degrees Fahrenheit. And realizing that the temperature in our marriage had been plummeting for years without me noticing. I started going to the local library just to be around people, even if I didn't talk to them, even if I just sat in the corner with a children's book. Reading aloud to myself in a whisper, trying to train my tongue to shape American sounds that felt so foreign and clumsy. The librarian, an older woman named Patricia with silver hair and kind eyes, started noticing me. And one day she came over with a cup of coffee and said, "Honey, you look like you need someone to talk to." And I burst into tears right there in the children's section because someone had finally seen me, actually seen me, after months of being invisible. Patricia didn't ask about my marriage or my immigration status or any of the complicated things that made my chest tight. She just sat with me and told me about her own struggles, how she had come to America from Ireland 40 years ago. How she had felt exactly this cold, this isolation, this bone-deep loneliness that makes you wonder if you made a terrible mistake. And she said something that changed everything for me. The cold is just weather, love, but the loneliness is a choice. And you don't have to choose it forever. That week, I signed up for an English conversation class at the community center, and walking into that room full of other non-native speakers, all of us stumbling over words and laughing at our own mistakes, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt normal. I felt seen. I felt like I wasn't the only one fighting this battle. But then I made the mistake of telling Mark about my class, hoping he would be proud of me. Hoping it would be the bridge we needed to cross back to each other, and he just looked at me with that hollow expression and said, "That's nice. Honey," the same way you'd congratulate a stranger on their promotion. And I knew right then that the cold that was killing our marriage had nothing to do with the weather outside and everything to do with the man who had stopped seeing me as his wife and started treating me like a roommate he was too polite to evict. A glimpse of hope. Sometimes the smallest moments, the ones you almost miss because they're so ordinary, so ridiculously mundane, end up being the ones that crack your heart wide open and let the light in. And for me, that moment happened not in a grand gesture or a tearful reconciliation, but in a fluorescent-lit community center classroom surrounded by a dozen other immigrants who were just as lost, just as lonely, and just as desperate to find their voice as I was. And I realized that hope doesn't always arrive like a thunderbolt. Sometimes it creeps in like a whisper, like the soft sound of someone saying your name correctly for the first time in months. My English conversation class became my sanctuary, my tiny rebellion against the silence that had consumed my marriage. And every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I would walk into that room and feel something I had forgotten existed. I felt like I belonged. There was Maria from Mexico, who couldn't pronounce squirrel without making everyone laugh, and Ahmed from Egypt, who kept mixing up beach and bitch and had accidentally told his landlord he loved the bitch near his apartment. And we all laughed until our stomachs hurt because laughter, I was learning, is a universal language that requires no translation. Our teacher, a young American man named David who had spent years teaching English abroad, had a way of making us feel like our mistakes weren't failures but stepping stones. And one evening he looked at me and said something that hit me like a punch to the chest. You speak with your heart, not just your mouth. And that's something no grammar book can teach. I went home that night with a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the heater, and for the first time in months, I looked at Mark and didn't feel that familiar ache of disappointment. I felt something closer to pity. Because while I was out there fighting to rebuild my voice, he was still hiding behind his silence, still pretending that everything was fine, still incapable of admitting that he had already checked out of our marriage long before we ever left our home country. The most bizarre part of this entire journey was that learning English, the thing I had feared and resented for so long, became the very thing that saved me, not because it made me sound more American, but because it gave me the words to finally articulate what I had been feeling for years, that I deserved to be seen, to be heard. To be loved in a language that didn't require me to shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations. I started journaling in English, writing down my thoughts in my broken, imperfect sentences, and the more I wrote, the clearer my feelings became. Until one night I wrote a sentence that made me stop and stare at the page. I am not lonely because I am in America. I am lonely because I am the only one still fighting for us. And in that moment, I realized that the person I had been waiting to save me, the person I had been hoping would suddenly wake up and see me, was never going to come. Because the only person who could save me was already here, already capable. Already strong enough to walk away from a marriage that had become a prison, and I didn't need a divorce attorney to do it. I just needed the courage to say the words I had been practicing in my head for months. The following Tuesday, I walked into class and told David that I was ready to write a letter, a real letter, in English, to my husband. And he smiled and said, "You're already writing your own story, you just need to finish it." And that night, I sat down with my notebook, took a deep breath, and wrote the first sentence that would change everything. Dear Mark, I have finally learned how to say goodbye in English, and it sounds like freedom. The language of love. I never realized that the phrase "I love you" could sound so different depending on who was saying it. Until I stood in my living room on a Tuesday evening, holding a letter I had written in my broken, imperfect English, and watched my husband's face transform from indifference to something I hadn't seen in years, genuine surprise, and I understood for the first time that love isn't about speaking perfectly, it's about being brave enough to speak at all, even when your words are messy. Even when your grammar is wrong, even when every cell in your body is screaming at you to stay silent and safe. The letter I wrote to Mark wasn't elegant or poetic, it was raw and clumsy and full of mistakes that would have made my English teacher wince. But it was honest, and that honesty terrified me more than any perfectly constructed sentence ever could. I told him about the loneliness, the cold, the nights I cried into my pillow while he slept peacefully beside me. The way I felt like a ghost in my own marriage. The way I had stopped recognizing myself in the mirror because I had spent so long trying to become someone he would notice again. And I told him about my English class, about Maria and Ahmed and David, about the laughter and the mistakes and the small victories. About how learning this language had taught me something I never expected, it had taught me to listen to myself. To hear my own voice after years of drowning it out for the sake of keeping the peace. I ended the letter with a sentence that took me 20 minutes to write because I kept second-guessing every word. I don't need you to stay with me, Mark, I need you to see me, and if you can't do that, then I need you to let me go, because I would rather be alone in America than lonely with you. I handed him the letter that night, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, and I watched as he unfolded the paper and started reading. His expression shifting from confusion to discomfort to something that looked almost like fear, and when he finished, he didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. He just stood there, holding my letter like it was a live grenade, and then he did something I never expected. He walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up a pen, and started writing on a napkin, his handwriting messy and hurried, and when he handed it to me, I saw 3 words that made my heart stop. I am sorry. Not "I'm sorry you feel that way" or "I'm sorry things are hard," just "I am sorry." 3 simple words in English that he had never said to me before, not like this. Not with his eyes wet and his hands trembling and his voice cracking when he finally spoke. And then he said something in English that he had clearly been practicing. Something he had never said to me in our native language because it was too vulnerable, too raw. "I don't know how to be your husband anymore. But I want to learn again." The irony wasn't lost on me. We had both been learning English, but we had forgotten how to speak to each other. And standing there in our kitchen with snow falling outside and a napkin in my hands, I realized that language isn't just words. It's the courage to be misunderstood and still keep talking. But just as I opened my mouth to respond, my phone buzzed on the counter. And I saw a notification from my English class group chat that made my blood run cold. Maria had been deported, and the message read, "They took her this morning. I don't know where she is." 2 worlds, 1 home. The moment I saw that message about Maria, the fragile hope that had bloomed between Mark and me shattered like glass on a cold floor. And I realized that my story wasn't just about a failing marriage, it was about a woman caught between 2 worlds, neither of which felt like home. And I had been so focused on saving my relationship that I had forgotten to save myself. To build a life that didn't crumble every time the wind blew in a different direction. Maria had been my anchor in that English class, the one who laughed at my mistakes and made me feel like my broken sentences were beautiful, not embarrassing. And now she was gone, ripped away from a country she had grown to love, leaving behind an apartment full of half-finished dreams and a daughter who would grow up wondering why her mother's love wasn't enough to keep her in America. I sat on my kitchen floor that night, the napkin with Mark's apology crumpled in my hand, and I cried for Maria, for myself, for every immigrant who had ever felt like they were one wrong word away from losing everything they had built. And Mark, for the first time in years, didn't walk away. He sat down beside me on that cold tile floor, his shoulder touching mine. And he didn't say anything, because sometimes silence isn't abandonment, it's solidarity. And I realized that the language of love isn't always spoken, sometimes it's felt. Like the warmth of someone's presence when the world feels like it's collapsing around you. That night, we talked for hours, not about the divorce attorney or the past or all the ways we had failed each other, but about the present. About Maria and the injustice of her deportation. About the children we had always talked about having but never did. About the future we could still build if we were brave enough to start over. And somewhere between 2 a.m. and dawn, Mark said something that made me look at him differently. I was so busy trying to provide the American dream that I forgot to ask what your dream was. And I don't think I ever really knew you, not the real you. The you that exists outside of our marriage. I realized then that my English class had given me something I didn't expect. It had given me a community, a voice, a reason to fight. And I had been so focused on what I was losing with Mark that I had forgotten to see what I was gaining on my own. The weeks that followed were strange and beautiful and terrifying. We started dating again, like 2 people who had just met. Going to coffee shops where I practiced my English ordering skills and he listened without correcting me. Taking walks in the park where I would point to things and ask for the English word, and he would smile and say it slowly, patiently. The way you teach a child to speak. And in those moments, I fell in love with him again, not the man he used to be, but the man he was becoming. The man who was finally willing to sit in the discomfort of my broken English and wait for me to find my words. I brought him to my English class, introduced him to Ahmed and David, and watched as he clumsily tried to say hello to Maria's empty chair. His eyes filling with tears as he whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't understand what you were all going through." But then, one evening, David pulled me aside after class and told me something that made my stomach drop. He had heard from Maria. And she had sent him a letter with information about a new immigration policy that could affect me directly, and the news was not good. Breaking the ice. The news David gave me that evening felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. Because he told me that Maria's deportation wasn't just bad luck, it was part of a new wave of immigration enforcement that was targeting people exactly like me, people whose paperwork had minor errors, people who had been in the country for years without any problems. And suddenly I wasn't just fighting to save my marriage anymore. I was fighting to stay in the country I had started to call home. And the terrifying part was that I had no idea if my own status was secure or if I was one bureaucratic mistake away from being put on a plane back to a life I no longer recognized. I stood in the parking lot of that community center, the cold Ohio wind biting at my face. And I felt the ground beneath me shift in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, because for the first time since arriving in America, I realized that my future wasn't in my hands. That my entire existence in this country depended on paperwork and policies and people who had never met me. And that realization was more terrifying than any marriage crisis or language barrier I had ever faced. That night, I went home and told Mark everything, expecting him to panic or retreat into his usual silence. But instead he did something I never expected. He pulled out his laptop, opened a document, and said, "We are going to fix this together. And I'm not letting you go, not to another country, not to another life, not anywhere." He started researching immigration lawyers, making calls, writing emails, and watching him fight for me, fight for us. Was like watching a man wake up from a long coma, suddenly aware that the life he had been sleepwalking through was actually worth saving. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and phone calls and meetings with lawyers, and through it all, Mark was by my side. Learning the language of immigration the same way I had learned the language of America, imperfectly, fearfully. But with a determination that made me fall in love with him all over again. I started recording myself speaking English, practicing my answers for potential interviews. And Mark would sit across from me and ask me questions until my tongue felt like it was going to fall out, not because he was testing me, but because he wanted to make sure I was prepared for anything, that no immigration officer would ever catch me off guard. And in those practice sessions, something shifted between us. We stopped being a broken couple and started being a team. Two people who had forgotten how to fight together but were learning again, one question at a time, one conversation at a time, one small victory at a time. I remember the day my lawyer told me I had a hearing date. And I sat in her office with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold the pen to sign the form. And Mark reached over, took my hand, and said in his own broken way, "I will be there with you, and I will not leave, no matter what happens." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I spent every spare moment between then and the hearing practicing English. Reading news articles aloud until my voice was hoarse, writing sentences in my journal until my hand cramped. Because I knew that the outcome of that hearing would depend on my ability to articulate my life, my love, my reasons for staying in America, in a language I was still learning to call my own. And when I walked into that courtroom, I saw Maria's face in my mind, and I heard her voice telling me that we don't give up, we don't stop fighting. We don't let fear write our ending. But as the immigration officer opened the file and started reading my case, my heart stopped, because the first question she asked was about a discrepancy in my paperwork that I had never even noticed. And I realized that my entire future was balanced on the edge of a single word. Not lonely anymore. The immigration officer's question about the discrepancy in my paperwork hung in the air like a guillotine blade. And I felt every single English word I had ever learned evaporate from my brain, leaving me utterly speechless, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I was so terrified of saying it wrong, of using the wrong tense, the wrong pronunciation, the wrong anything that could send me back to a country that no longer felt like home. And I realized that the fear of making a mistake in English had followed me all the way from that first humiliating grocery store encounter to this courtroom where my entire future was being decided. But then I heard a voice in my head, not Maria's or David's or even Mark's, it was my own voice. The one I had been practicing in front of the mirror every morning for months. The one that had learned to say I am here and I belong and I have a story worth telling. And I opened my mouth and spoke, slowly at first, then with more confidence, explaining that the date on my application was off by 1 day because the airline had changed my flight and I had panicked and written the wrong number, that it was a human error, not a lie, that I was not trying to deceive anyone. I was just trying to survive in a country where every date and every signature and every document felt like a test I was destined to fail. The officer looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she did something that shocked me. She smiled, just a tiny, almost imperceptible smile, and said, "Your English has improved significantly since your arrival. That's evidence of effort, of integration, of someone who wants to be here." And in that moment, I realized that my struggle with English, the thing I had hated and feared and resented for so long, had become my greatest ally, proof that I had been trying, that I had been fighting, that I had been willing to learn and grow and change in a way that most people never have to do. The hearing ended with a decision. I was granted a permanent resident status, not because of my marriage to Mark, but because I had proven that I was building a life here, a real life, with connections and contributions, and a future that existed outside of any relationship. When I walked out of that courtroom, Mark was waiting for me, and he didn't ask if I had won or lost, he just opened his arms and held me. The way he should have held me the day we arrived in America, the way he had been too afraid to hold me for years. And I cried into his chest not because I was relieved, but because I felt, for the first time since we landed, that I was not alone. We went home and cooked dinner together, a simple meal of spaghetti and salad that we had made 100 times before. But this time it tasted different, like we were tasting each other for the first time. Like the years of silence and distance had been washed away by a single decision to show up, to be present, to choose each other even when it was hard. And as we sat at our kitchen table, the snow melting outside our window, Mark looked at me and said something that made my heart ache with its simplicity. I don't think I ever knew how to love you properly. But I want to learn, and I want you to teach me, even if it takes the rest of our lives. That night, I called Maria from my phone, and she answered on the second ring. Her voice tearful and joyful and full of that same fighting spirit I had fallen in love with in our English class. And she told me she was back in her home country, but she was doing well. She was teaching English to children in her village, and she said, "You know what I learned from all of this? Home isn't a place on a map, it's the people who see you, truly see you, and refuse to let you disappear." And just as I was about to tell her how much she meant to me, Mark walked into the room with a photograph I had never seen before, a photo from our wedding day, both of us so young and hopeful, and on the back, in his handwriting, were the words "We made it," written years before we ever boarded that plane. And I realized that sometimes the ending of a story is just the beginning of a new one. Your story begins. So here I am, sitting in the same suburban kitchen where I once felt like a ghost in my own marriage. Except everything has changed. The snow outside still falls, the coffee is still too weak, and the neighbors still wave with that polite American distance, but inside these walls, inside my chest, inside the heart of my marriage, there is warmth now, real warmth. The kind that doesn't depend on a thermostat or a perfect pronunciation or a husband who suddenly remembers how to love. It depends on showing up, on being vulnerable, on choosing each other even when it's easier to walk away. And I have learned that the loneliest place in America isn't a foreign country with unfamiliar customs. It's a life where you have stopped believing that you deserve to be seen. The journey from that freezing Ohio winter to this quiet spring morning has been the hardest thing I have ever done. Not because of the immigration hearings or the language barriers or the cultural differences, but because it forced me to confront the one person I had been running from my entire life, myself. I had spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect immigrant, the perfect English speaker, that I had completely forgotten who I was underneath all that performance, underneath all that trying, underneath all that desperate, exhausting effort to be someone other people would find acceptable. And the truth that I finally accepted, the truth that saved my marriage and my sanity and my soul, is that you cannot love anyone else until you learn to love yourself, and you cannot be seen by anyone else until you learn to see yourself. And you cannot find your voice in any language until you believe that what you have to say is worth hearing. I still make mistakes in English all the time. I still confuse sheep and ship and accidentally tell my neighbors that I'm going to the beach when I mean the beach. And I still pause in the middle of sentences to search for words that seem to have hidden themselves in the deepest corners of my brain, but I don't apologize for it anymore, not to strangers, not to Mark, and not to myself. Because I have learned that the goal of language isn't perfection. It's connection, and every mistake I make is just another opportunity for someone to see the real me behind the imperfect words. Mark and I are still learning how to be married, still figuring out what it means to love each other in a country that wasn't built for either of us. But we are doing it together now. not as two strangers sharing a house, but as two people who have survived the worst version of themselves and decided to become better. We have started talking about having children, about building a family that will grow up speaking both languages, about creating a home where mistakes are celebrated as proof of trying, where silence is never mistaken for abandonment, where love is measured not in perfect sentences but in the courage to keep speaking even when you're terrified of being misunderstood. And that photograph from our wedding day, the one with the words "We made it" written on the back, now hangs on our refrigerator. Not as a reminder of who we used to be, but as a promise of who we are becoming. Because the truth is, none of us ever really make it. We just keep showing up, keep trying, keep loving, keep speaking, even when the words fail us. Especially when the words fail us, because that is what it means to be human, to be in love, to be alive. And if there is one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this: wherever you are, whatever language you're struggling to learn, whatever relationship you're fighting to save, whatever loneliness you're carrying in your chest like a stone, you are not invisible. You are not alone, and your story is far from over. Now, it's your turn to pick up the pen, open your mouth, and start writing your own ending, because the best stories are the ones we are brave enough to tell, even when we don't have all the words yet. That's all for today. I'll make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to see them.